She walked into the courtroom like a shadow, with a purpose quiet, steady, and sharper than the silence around her. No badge on her chest, no title to announce her rank. Just a black coat, a leather satchel, and a stare that didn't blink. The walls were old, but the corruption inside them was older. He laughed when he saw her, smirked like he'd won before the hearing ever began, called her the help before she'd even spoken. But by the end of that day, his badge was gone, the judge had vanished, and the system they built together was standing trial. She wasn't a witness, she wasn't a victim. She was the one holding the match. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Let's begin. It began on a gray morning, the kind where even the courthouse windows seemed reluctant to let in light, as if they too understood the weight of what was about to unfold. The air inside the courtroom was thick with that quiet tension, familiar to anyone who's ever waited for justice in a room where justice rarely lives. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like distant insects, casting a sterile glow over worn benches, faded legal pads, and the impassive faces of men who'd sat in judgment far too long to still believe in truth. Naomi R. Carter, wrapped in a charcoal trench coat and carrying a leather briefcase, moved with a kind of practiced invisibility through the security line. Her presence neither grand nor meek, just deliberate, composed, and absolutely unreadable. She took a seat near the back in the left corner of the gallery, her posture straight, her hands resting gently on her knees, her gaze moving slowly around the room. Nobody looked at her twice. That was the plan. She didn't speak, didn't shift in her seat, didn't draw attention. There was a man on trial, Officer Mitch Kincaid, a white cop with 17 years on the force, and a history of complaints that had never once seen the light of court. And across the aisle, a young black man sat with his lawyer eyes, downcast the collar of his shirt, trembling slightly with every breath. Naomi's eyes lingered on him for a moment, not with pity, but with something older, deeper recognition. The bailiff called the room to order, and as people stood, sat, and shuffled their papers, Naomi didn't move. Her breath was slow, controlled. She had walked into many rooms like this before, but never under these exact terms. She wasn't here as a judge, she wasn't here as a lawyer, and as far as anyone else knew, she wasn't anyone worth noting at all. And that was exactly the point. She had come not to speak, but to watch, at least for now. She had been inserted into the witness list just 2 days earlier under a sealed designation, a formality approved quietly by a U.S. attorney 2 counties away, who owed her a favor. The paperwork said she'd witnessed the incident at a bus stop. The truth was more complicated. When Mitch Kincaid entered the courtroom, flanked by 2 attorneys, and grinning like the verdict had already been carved in marble, Naomi didn't blink. But her heart tightened in that slow, hard way that doesn't show on the surface. He didn't see her, not really, just another face in a sea of faces, until she was called. Witness number 4, the court clerk said, reading from the list without looking up. Naomi stood quietly, stepped into the aisle, and walked forward. That's when it happened. Mitch leaned back in his chair, arms draped across the rail, like a man holding court in his own kingdom, and smirked. "Well, damn," he said just loud enough for the jurors to hear someone let the help sit in the wrong section. There were chuckles, soft ones, nervous ones. One of the court officers tilted his head and smiled with half his mouth. Another leaned in and whispered, "She better know where the mop closet is." Naomi kept walking each step, steady her heels, tapping gently on the tile, the sound swallowed by silence and half-held laughter. Mitch wasn't finished. "Hope she brought her green card," he muttered toward the prosecution's table. "Though, let's be honest, they usually don't need one." Naomi didn't stop. She didn't respond. She simply sat when she reached her chair, crossed her ankles beneath her, folded her hands, and looked straight ahead. The judge didn't intervene. The bailiff didn't flinch. The prosecution looked down at their notes. And for a long moment the courtroom simply settled like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But inside her something was already shifting. Not anger, no, she had walked through too much fire in her life for that. It was focus. Cold, quiet, measured. She wasn't here to be provoked. She was here to finish what had been building for over a year. It was then that she felt it, the weight of every pair of eyes in that room that didn't look at her, and the ones that did, but only with amusement or disdain. It didn't hurt. It clarified. She had come to witness a system at work, and within 10 seconds, It had shown her everything she needed to see. She thought about the folder in her briefcase, the recordings on the encrypted drive tucked beneath her coat, the testimony compiled over months of field interviews and sealed interviews with victims who hadn't dared step foot in a courtroom. She thought about the boy in the orange hoodie on trial, barely 21, who had once tried to hand a bus driver his transfer ticket and ended up with his face pressed to the pavement by the man now sitting smug and relaxed under fluorescent lights. The truth wasn't just coming, it was already here, and they had no idea. A whisper from the bench broke through her thoughts. "Ma'am," the clerk said again, "please state your name for the record." Naomi slowly turned her head toward the judge, her voice low and even. "Naomi Carter," she said, not yet giving them the rest. The judge nodded without recognition, scribbled something into his notes and gestured to proceed. She let her eyes travel once more around the courtroom, not with challenge, not with pride, but with awareness. The kind of awareness you only earn after decades of being told to wait your turn. She had waited long enough. And in that silence, in that chair beneath the sterile lights and the echoing cough of a janitor in the hall, Naomi knew she wasn't here to be seen. She was here to remind them what they refused to look at. And when the moment came, when the real truth was called forward, she wouldn't need to raise her voice. They would hear her just fine. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that the truth didn't always walk through the front door. It waited in the quiet corners, in sealed files, and behind the smiles of men who'd memorized the language of authority without ever having to answer to it. That's why when she stepped into the courtroom pretending to be just another witness, she wasn't playing a role. She was setting the stage. This wasn't improvisation, and it wasn't luck. It was precision. Months of planning, years of experience, and a deep understanding of how power behaves when it thinks no one important is watching. She wasn't there because she had stumbled upon injustice. She was there because she had followed its scent, cataloged its patterns, and built a case designed not just to reveal but to dismantle. The operation had begun quietly under federal jurisdiction, with only a handful of trusted agents in the loop, people who knew how to move without noise, how to document without alerting the system they were investigating. Naomi had been recruited not as a symbol but as a tactician, someone who could walk into a room full of wolves and make them believe she was just another sheep. Her badge remained tucked inside a folder in a locked drawer at the field office, her name scrubbed from public directories, her movements timed and recorded down to the minute. For months, she had lived between the lines, speaking little, watching much, collecting whispers that others ignored. There were nights she came home and sat in the silence of her small apartment, the only sound, the slow tick of a clock above the window, her eyes fixed on a legal pad covered in initials and arrows and timelines. She didn't keep photos on her walls or personal items in her bag. Everything she needed was in her head. Sometimes late at night, she'd ask herself why she'd said yes to this job. Why, after everything, after retirement, after losing family to this same system, she had agreed to step back into the fire. The answer always came in the form of a face. Not one she could name, but many she could never forget. A teenage boy's jaw bruised purple under the courthouse lights. A woman's hands shaking as she clutched a wrinkled summons. A father wiping sweat from his collar, hoping his accent wouldn't be used against him. They stayed with her, those ghosts, not as burdens but as fuel. "If not me," she whispered once out loud to no one, then who? The weight of the question didn't scare her anymore. What scared her was silence. What scared her was looking away. 2 weeks before the trial, Naomi met with Rosa, one of the lead agents in the operation, in the back of a diner, where the jukebox always played too loud and the waitress never asked questions. Rosa slid a manila envelope across the table, her expression unreadable. "Kincaid's clean on paper," she said, "but it's too clean. Internal reports are redacted. Body cam footage goes missing. Someone's scrubbing it before it hits review." Naomi didn't respond right away. She flipped open the folder, studied the photocopies, blurred timestamps, officer statements, signed in the same handwriting disciplinary memos marked inconclusive. She didn't blink, and the judge she asked quietly. Rosa sighed. "Drury's been on the bench 30 years. Never had a formal complaint stick. But the pattern's there, he favors. Officers ignores objections, suppresses motions without explanation." Naomi closed the folder, set it gently on the table, and sipped her coffee. "Then we have enough to move," she said. Rosa frowned. "We still need the trigger. something undeniable, something public. Naomi nodded slowly, then looked out the window where snow began to fall in soft spirals across the empty parking lot. "He'll give it to us," she murmured. "They always do when they think you have no power." And that's how it began. Not with a fight, not with a protest, but with a woman walking into a courtroom knowing exactly what was about to happen and daring to let it unfold. She didn't need to provoke Mitch Kincaid. She knew the moment he saw her, black, older, quiet, he'd react the way men like him always do. With arrogance, with mockery, with the assumption that she was beneath him. And in that assumption, he would reveal everything they needed. What most people don't understand about power is that it rarely breaks with a bang. It unravels thread by thread when someone pulls at the right corner with steady hands. Naomi was that someone. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Her stillness wasn't hesitation, it was control. And when Mitch laughed in court when he leaned back and made his joke about green cards and cleaning supplies, he wasn't just mocking her. He was handing her the match she'd been waiting for. Back at the field office, while the courtroom recessed for lunch, Rosa played back the audio feed. The tape was crisp, the words unmistakable. "We got him," she said, into her headset. Naomi, still seated in the gallery, didn't smile. She didn't move. She simply crossed her legs the other way, tilted her chin slightly, and looked straight ahead. Because this wasn't the end, it was only the first crack in a wall built to last forever, and once it started falling, nothing would stop it. The operations room was tucked behind a reinforced door at the far end of the federal building where the walls were lined with whiteboards stained faintly with ghost markers, and the faint hum of air conditioning gave the whole place the sound of a slow, steady exhale. It didn't look like the kind of space where revolutions started, no high-tech glass panels, no sprawling monitors, but it was here in this quiet space of coffee-stained folders and half-worn carpet that Naomi Carter pulled open a drawer and laid bare the anatomy of a broken system. She stood at the center of the room, her coat draped over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled just past the elbow, the light above casting sharp shadows across her cheekbones as she flipped through documents that should never have existed. Pinned to the board behind her was a timeline marked with colored string and push pins, red for witness statements, blue for evidence logs, yellow for internal memos. But the lines didn't just track dates, they told a story one thread at a time. "He doesn't just disappear cases," Rosa said, standing by the printout wall with a marker in her hand. "He reassigns them, slips them out of rotation, claims conflicts, closes them without final review." Naomi didn't look up. She was staring at a digital still pulled from a corrupted bodycam file, grainy but clear enough to show Kincaid's hand gripping a young man's throat, his face half-shadowed by the cruiser light. And every time Naomi replied, her voice even but taut, it gets filed as minimal force. No inquiry, no follow-up, just 3 boxes ticked and a supervisor's signature. In the center of the table sat a stack of personnel files thicker than they should have been, dog-eared, and smudged, filled with reports that had been sealed under administrative confidentiality. Naomi reached for one marked Cased 7483K, flipped it open and scanned the page. "Same precinct, same officer, same kind of victim," she murmured. But every single time a different excuse. Missing footage, unavailable witnesses, judges citing procedural errors. She paused, then looked up. "And Drury's name is on nearly all of them." Rosa nodded and pulled up a chart on her tablet, sliding it across the table. "We cross-referenced courtroom schedules," she explained. "Drury oversaw 34 cases involving Kincaid in the past 5 years. 26 ended in dismissals. 8 resulted in charges being dropped by the prosecution. 0 convictions." Naomi stared at the data, her fingers resting lightly on the screen, but her mind was already running faster than her eyes. It wasn't just coincidence, it was choreography. Someone had spent years perfecting the rhythm of denial and disappearance, and now they were standing at the edge of being exposed. She sat down slowly, her back straight, her shoulders drawn with tension she didn't bother to hide anymore. "What about financials?" she asked. Another agent, Marcus, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Drury receives quarterly deposits from a foundation tied to a private correctional contractor. It's buried under layers of charitable language, but the trail's there." Naomi's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. Kickbacks for favorable rulings, Marcus hesitated. We can't say that yet. But the money lines up with the dates of 2 major dismissals. Naomi didn't respond right away. She stared at the wall, eyes locked on the face of a boy who'd been beaten near a bus stop, the case number scrawled beneath the photo like an afterthought. That boy's name was Terrence Riley. He had no prior record, no weapons, no resistance noted in the officer's report. Just acting erratic, the kind of phrase they use when they can't prove anything but want fear to do the rest. Naomi remembered the footage, even in its partial form, the way Terrence's knees gave out the way, his hands stayed open even as the baton came down. He'd survived barely and moved out of state before the trial was scheduled. His mother had called Naomi 6 weeks ago, unsure of who to trust, unsure if speaking again would mean more surveillance, more questions, more risk. She said she still keeps his clothes folded in a box, Naomi had told Rosa afterward, because she couldn't wash the blood out of the cuffs. Those were the stories that didn't fit on the board, the ones you couldn't tag with string or color code in a spreadsheet. They were the weight behind the case. The reason this had to land, because what was being built here wasn't just a file, it was a mirror, a record of how a courthouse could look like justice and sound like justice and still rot quietly from the inside out. Naomi stood again, pacing slowly around the room, arms folded. "We're close," she said, mostly to herself, but loud enough for the team to hear. "He gave us the moment in that courtroom. Now we need to structure it. Build the case that will not just expose them, but indict them." Rosa stepped forward, hesitant. "There's a risk," she said. "If this leaks before the grand jury, they'll paint it as political, as revenge." Naomi turned toward her steady. "Then we don't leak. We execute. When it lands all at once." In that moment the room was silent, save for the low buzz of the overhead light and the faint clicking of Rosa's pen against her clipboard. Naomi felt the familiar tightness in her chest, part nerves, part clarity, the sense that something irreversible was approaching, that once they stepped past this point, there would be no unknowing what had been uncovered. And that was the hardest part. Not the exposure, not the backlash, but the knowledge that even when the truth comes out, not everyone will want to hear it. Still, she knew what had to be done. The threads were in her hand now, and she was ready to pull. Because some walls don't fall by force, they fall by design. One string at a time. There were things Naomi Carter didn't often speak about, not because she was afraid to, but because once said aloud, they had a way of reshaping the room. Memories had mass. They pressed against the ribs and altered how you breathed. And the one that never truly let go of her was the night her little brother was taken lifted off a city sidewalk by a patrol officer who said he matched a description, though no description had ever been released. Naomi had only been 19, then already 2 semesters into pre-law, full of lectures about due process and Miranda rights. But none of that mattered the night she watched her mother sit motionless at the kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, voice too quiet to be heard over the storm of sirens outside. His name was Jordan. He had been walking home from tutoring, a pocket dictionary in his back pocket, and a new set of headphones he'd saved up for with summer work at the library. Naomi remembered the way his voice cracked with excitement when he showed them to her, noise-canceling, he'd said proudly. Like the ones you see on courtroom reporters. She'd smiled, ruffled his hair, and told him he'd better make sure Mom didn't catch him spending money on anything other than books. But then came the call, the holding cell. The bruises he tried to laugh off with a weak smile. "It's nothing," he said. "It's fine." But it wasn't fine, and she knew it even then, even before the court date, before the public defender, who never looked him in the eye, before the judge, who never once acknowledged that Jordan had been a kid with no record and an acceptance letter waiting for him on the kitchen counter. They said he reached for something, probably the headphones. They said the officer feared for his safety. They said it like a script, like something that had already been carved into a stone wall behind the bench. Jordan spent 14 months in juvenile detention. 14 months of missed classes, missed birthdays, missed nights where the 3 of them used to eat spaghetti in front of the television and argue about movie endings. When the charges were eventually dropped quietly without apology or explanation, it was too late. Something in him had hardened, or maybe something in all of them had. That memory lived in Naomi like a spine, invisible but structural. It held up everything she became. She didn't talk about it in interviews or during panel discussions on civil rights, and she never once used it in closing arguments. But it was there every time she stepped into a courtroom. It was there the first time she saw a cop smirk while a mother wept in the gallery. It was there in the silence between gavels and pleas where the law didn't fail so much as look the other way. Years later, when she earned her seat as a federal judge, Naomi sat alone in her chambers that first night, the only light coming from a desk lamp and the soft glow of a city that didn't know who she was. She held Jordan's old headphones in her lap. He'd left them behind when he moved away for good, and she ran her fingers over the frayed cord and cracked plastic. And for the first time in over a decade she cried, not loud, not long. Just enough to say she still remembered. Just enough to let herself feel what she'd buried beneath transcripts and verdicts. That's why when she saw the boy in the courtroom this time, the one across the aisle from Kincaid with his collar trembling and hands too still, she didn't see a stranger. She saw every young man who had ever been cornered by assumption and stripped of his innocence by a process that called itself justice but behaved more like ritual. She didn't need to read the officer's report to know what it would say. She'd memorized the language non-compliant furtive movements officer perceived a threat. And just like always, it would be written in a tone that asked no questions and demanded no proof. So Naomi made a choice, not in that moment, but long before, back when Rosa first handed her the case file, back when the initial complaint against Kincaid looked like 1,000 others. She chose to go in person. She chose not to send a surrogate or monitor the trial remotely. She chose to walk into that courtroom to sit with the people who never got to sit behind the bench to be seen, not for her credentials but for her skin, her silence, her stillness. Because only then could she know for sure, only then could she watch the lie reveal itself in real time. And it had. As predictably and casually as she feared it would. A man who didn't recognize power unless it wore a robe or a badge mocking her to her face because he thought she didn't matter. But she had never needed recognition. She only needed confirmation. That they were still who she suspected they were. That the machine was still humming in the same rhythm even after all these years. Now sitting alone later that evening, in her apartment with her shoes still by the door and her coat draped across the arm of the chair, Naomi stared out the window at the city, blinking in amber light. She thought of her brother, where he might be tonight, whether he knew what she was doing, whether he still wore headphones when he walked through unfamiliar neighborhoods. She reached for the folder on her kitchen table, flipped it open, and looked at the face of the boy in court one more time. "I'm not here to save anyone," she whispered more to herself than to the room. "I'm here to make sure they never forget what we remember." And with that, she closed the file, stood and walked toward her bedroom where the casework would wait for her tomorrow. But tonight she allowed herself the silence not as retreat but as preparation. Because the story was no longer just Jordan's, it was everyone's. And this time, it wasn't going to disappear. That morning the courthouse felt different, not louder or more crowded, but charged like the quiet before a storm that knows exactly when and where to break. Naomi felt it the moment she stepped inside her boots, clicking softly against the marble floor as she passed the metal detectors. Her breath measured her eyes, scanning each hallway as if each corner might suddenly shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in their usual monotone, but today even that sound seemed sharper, thinner, like it was straining to keep up with what was coming. Outside the courtroom doors, a few reporters whispered while adjusting their cameras, pretending not to notice her, though one of them followed her movements with barely concealed curiosity. Inside the courtroom was already half full, spectators murmuring softly, legal teams flipping through papers, and officers seated with folded arms, their postures relaxed, in a way that only happens when people are too sure they're untouchable. Naomi walked past them quietly, not because she needed to avoid attention, but because she wanted to feel the room shift the moment they realized who she really was. But for now, they still didn't know. And that ignorance, that presumption, was the final piece she needed. She took her seat near the front, the same seat from the day before, hands folded neatly in her lap, face calm, unreadable. Officer Kincaid sat 3 rows over, leaning back again, with that same lazy smirk that had become his trademark in courtrooms like this one. He looked at her, then past her, then turned to whisper something to the officer beside him. Another chuckle, another joke passed between men who thought the rules would never find them. Naomi didn't react. She'd already memorized the rhythm of their arrogance. What mattered now wasn't what they said, it was what she would say next. The judge entered Drury, still polished in his black robes, still uninterested in eye contact with anyone not wearing a badge or a tie. He called the court to order with the practiced authority of someone who had done it 10,000 times and stopped meaning it by the third. "Let's proceed," he said dryly, already flipping through pages as if the outcome were inevitable. The prosecution stood their voice steady but slightly hesitant. "Your Honor, before we begin with closing arguments, the witness has requested to submit new evidence relevant to these proceedings." There was a pause. Drury looked up annoyed more than curious. New evidence. At this stage, his tone wasn't surprised. It was bothered, inconvenienced, as though he were being asked to extend a meal he'd already decided he was done with. "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor continued. "It includes documentation, audio files, and internal communications related not only to the incident in question, but to patterns of conduct that directly impact the credibility of this court." Drury sighed, rubbed his forehead, then motioned lazily. "Proceed. Make it quick." Naomi reached down into the black leather satchel at her feet and withdrew 2 items, a thick white envelope and a flash drive, both labeled, both pristine. She handed them to the bailiff, who glanced at her briefly before delivering them to the clerk. The flash drive was inserted into the court's display system, and for a moment the lights dimmed slightly as the projector screen lit up with a cold blue glow. What followed wasn't an outburst. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was clear. It was Officer Mitch Kincaid's voice echoing over the courtroom speakers with a clarity that made the room freeze. "They always end up here," his voice said. "Doesn't matter if it's a traffic stop or a court date, it's either drugs or drama." A chuckle followed. Another officer responded with a slur. Then came more snippets of locker room talk turned criminal confession. "You want a complaint," buried Kincaid's voice again. "Send it Drury's way. He'll sink it so deep even God won't find it." The courtroom was silent. The jurors stared ahead, jaws, tight eyes suddenly unblinking. Judge Drury's hand stiffened on the arm of his chair. For the first time he looked unsure. The prosecutor cleared their throat. "There's more, Your Honor," they said. "But I believe the court should hear directly from the witness." Drury didn't respond, just nodded slowly like the movement cost him more than he expected. Naomi walked to the stand, her footsteps steady, her expression still unreadable. When she sat, she looked directly at the jury, not with challenge, but with purpose. "My name is Naomi Carter," she said, "and I have not come here as a witness. I have come as the lead federal investigator assigned to a classified operation investigating systemic misconduct within this courthouse." Gasps didn't erupt, they rippled. You could feel the air change, as if every breath in the room had thickened at once. "For the past 10 months, she continued, I have been documenting evidence of coordinated suppression, judicial collusion, and the repeated mishandling of cases involving Officer Mitch Kincaid, presided over by Judge Alan Drury. Drury shifted in his chair, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came. Naomi didn't stop. This evidence was gathered in accordance with Department of Justice protocols. It includes internal emails, redacted disciplinary files, and audio recordings, like the one you just heard, captured through legal surveillance. She turned her gaze toward Kincaid, who now sat frozen, the color drained from his face. "Officer Kincaid is not simply on trial for one incident," she said. "He represents a pattern of targeting, silencing, and erasure that has cost lives, ruined families, and undermined the very idea of equal protection under law." Someone in the gallery let out a quiet breath like they'd been holding it for far too long. Naomi's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "This is not about vengeance," she said softly. "This is about truth. And truth once spoken does not belong to silence again." She looked out over the room one last time. Some stared in awe, some in shame, and others like Kincaid and Drury simply stared back at her with the faces of men who finally understood that the thing they thought could never happen was already happening. The reckoning had begun, and Naomi, standing not above them but among them, had just pulled the first lever. There was a kind of stillness in the courtroom that didn't come from quiet, but from something more immediate recognition, like everyone had been holding their breath for so long, they'd forgotten what it meant to exhale. Naomi Carter stood at the witness stand, not as a plaintiff, not as a bystander, but as a storm cloaked in calm, her voice steady, her hands still, her gaze fixed not on the people who believed they ran this courtroom, but on the ones who never thought they had a voice in it. For a few seconds after her final words, no one moved, as if motion itself might shatter whatever illusion of control still lingered in the air. Mitch Kincaid's jaw twitched his shoulders, rigid now not from pride but from panic that had no script. He looked at the judge for rescue, for denial, for dismissal, anything that might reset the room back to the safety of status quo. But Judge Drury wasn't looking at him. The judge, once so composed, so confidently disengaged, now stared blankly at the bench. In front of him, fingers curled over the wood, like he was trying to hold on to something already slipping through. Naomi watched them both carefully, not with triumph, but with the cold clarity of someone who had studied this moment frame by frame before ever stepping into it. The prosecutor cleared their throat, almost reluctant to break the silence. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented, we ask that these materials be entered into the official record and that the court allow the witness to continue under oath regarding the ongoing federal investigation." Drury blinked once then again before mumbling something that sounded like agreement, though his voice had lost its edge. "Proceed," he said, barely audible, and for the first time all morning he looked smaller than his robe. Naomi turned back toward the jury, her expression softening just enough to meet their eyes without demanding anything from them. "This isn't just about Officer Kincaid," she began again. "It's about a system that allowed him to exist like this, unchecked, unchallenged, and protected." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't falter either. Every file that disappeared, every complaint that was dismissed, every body cam that malfunctioned, these weren't accidents. They were decisions. And decisions like those don't happen in the dark. They happen under lights, just like these, in rooms just like this, when people choose silence over accountability. In the back of the courtroom, someone shifted in their seat. A woman with graying hair and tired eyes clutched a manila envelope to her chest like it contained her whole life. She wasn't on the docket, she hadn't been called, but she was there, just like so many others, hoping quietly, desperately, that today might finally mean something. Naomi's eyes caught hers for half a second, and that was enough. Enough to remember why she'd chosen this path, why she had turned down offers for board seats and legal pundit jobs, and instead chosen to move through halls like these, gathering stories, collecting wounds, and carrying them forward until someone had to listen. Kincaid stood suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a jagged shard. "She's lying," he snapped. "This whole thing, it's a setup. She came in here to make a scene." His attorney reached for his arm, trying to pull him down, but he shook her off. "You don't get to rewrite my career because of one bad call," he barked, eyes now wide, with something between desperation and disbelief. "You think she's neutral. You think this wasn't personal from the start." Naomi didn't flinch. She looked at him the way one might look at a crumbling statue, familiar, expected, but irrelevant now. "You don't remember me," she said, her voice still low, still even. "But 4 years ago you testified in a case in Baltimore involving a boy accused of resisting arrest." She paused just long enough for the recognition to stir behind his confusion. "That boy was my cousin. He spent 14 months in juvenile detention before the case was thrown out for lack of evidence. You were never held accountable. Not then, but I remembered your face." The courtroom was silent again, this time with a weight so thick it seemed to press down from the ceiling. Naomi turned back to the jury. "This isn't revenge," she said. "This is what it looks like when truth catches up to power, when the room stops, pretending not to see." Her breath slowed slightly, not from nerves, but from the gravity of what she had just handed over. Not a story, but a mirror, and a choice about what they would do with it. Judge Drury shifted behind the bench, his voice breaking through the silence with a crack that betrayed his shaken control. "The court," he said, pausing to clear his throat, "acknowledges the testimony and evidence presented." He glanced toward Naomi, then back at the prosecutor. "We'll allow the submission and reconvene after review." But even as he said the words, it was clear something fundamental had already changed. The performance was over. The room had seen the stagehands behind the curtain. Naomi stepped down from the witness stand with the same deliberate grace she'd entered, with her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged. She passed by Kincaid without looking at him, without offering even a flicker of acknowledgement. That was the thing about truth. It didn't need to linger. It only needed to be heard. Behind her, murmurs began to rise. Not chaotic, not loud, but persistent, like a tide inching toward the shore after years of drought. The bailiff called for order, but there was no putting it back now. The shift had already taken root, not just in the courtroom, but in the minds of every person watching. Reporters at the back scribbled notes furiously, some already typing into phones, headlines forming before the verdict could even be considered. The woman with the envelope sat back in her seat, a single tear slipping down her cheek, not from sadness but from something deeper, something like relief, something like being believed. And as Naomi exited the room, she felt it not victory, not satisfaction, but confirmation. The thing she had carried in silence for so long was no longer hers alone. It now belonged to the record, to the moment, to the people who could no longer pretend not to know. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves against the courthouse steps, and Naomi paused for just a second, eyes closed, head tilted to the sky. She had more work to do. Much more. But today she had spoken. And for the first time in a long time, the system had listened. The day after Naomi's testimony, the courthouse didn't return to normal, not in feeling, not in tone, not even in routine. There was a subtle shift in the air, like a room that had been closed too long and finally opened, letting in something unfamiliar but necessary. People walked slower through the hallways, speaking more quietly, watching each other with a new kind of awareness. Even the coffee tasted different, burnt, bitter, unimportant. Something had cracked, and though the building stood unchanged on the outside, inside it was no longer the same place. The silence wasn't ordinary anymore. It was watchful. Naomi entered the federal building with her coat buttoned high, and her eyes focused forward, bypassing greetings, ignoring sidelong glances, and heading straight to the operations room where her team was already waiting. She moved with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this walk in her head 100 times but still felt the weight of every step now that it was real. Inside, the whiteboard had been updated, red string cut sharper lines. New names had been added. Others were circled in blue. And at the center, a printout of Judge Drury's signature, now evidence of something that couldn't be buried. Rosa stood near the board, holding a summary sheet in one hand and a highlighter in the other. Her posture was tense, her jaw tight. "Drury's gone quiet," she said without turning. "No motions, no statements. He's missed 2 internal memos and canceled 3 meetings." Naomi slipped off her gloves and set them on the table beside the file she'd carried home the night before. "He's calculating," she replied softly. "When power is cornered, it doesn't always run, it folds, then tries to re-emerge somewhere safer." Another agent, Marcus, stepped in from the side room with a folder of financial reports. "We're tracing shell contributions to a private law foundation connected to Drury's clerk. It's small, but the amounts match payouts from a precinct misconduct settlement last spring." Naomi took the file, her fingers brushing the paper lightly as she scanned the print. "That's not an accident," she murmured. "That's a pattern." She set the file down, leaned forward slightly, and asked, "What about Kincaid?" Rosa exhaled. "He's rattled. He showed up at the precinct this morning but didn't go inside. Just sat in his car, smoked, and drove off. He knows it's over, but he doesn't know how deep it goes yet." Naomi nodded, not in satisfaction, but in confirmation. "He will," she said. "He'll see it one layer at a time, just like we built it." For a moment the room was quiet, save for the low hum of the overhead lights and the soft shuffle of papers being moved. Naomi walked to the far window, looking out over the city, a pale wash of concrete, scattered trees, and low winter sunlight struggling to break through the clouds. Her reflection in the glass was faint, but there, and in it she saw not the woman who once fought to be heard in rooms like these, but the woman now deciding what came next. It didn't feel like power. It felt like responsibility, and that was heavier. Rosa crossed the room, her voice lower now. "What about the judge?" Naomi didn't turn. "We give him time," she said. "Let him wonder what we have. Let him make the next mistake." Then she turned back, her voice sharper. "But keep eyes on his clerk. If Drury doesn't try to hide it, someone will. That afternoon, as the courthouse recessed early to process the formal motions submitted after Naomi's testimony, Kincaid found himself alone in the break room. The laughter from his colleagues was gone. The knowing nods had faded. The silence now wasn't camaraderie, it was distance. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, staring at a bulletin board covered in community outreach posters and Officer of the Month photos. And for the first time in a long time, he looked like someone who didn't know what to do next. In the surveillance room, 3 floors above, Naomi watched the feed through a secure monitor. Her eyes didn't narrow in anger, nor did they soften in pity. They just observed patiently as a man built on impunity began to feel its absence. She leaned closer and asked Marcus, who was logging timestamps beside her. "How long until he talks?" Marcus shrugged. "Could be hours, could be days. Depends on how much he thinks he still has left to lose." Naomi didn't respond. She just nodded once and made a small mark in her notebook. The collapse had started, and now all they had to do was keep the structure from hiding its own rubble. Later that night, Naomi sat alone at her dining table, the room dim, except for a single lamp glowing above her notes. The city outside was quiet, a few car horns, a distant siren, the low hum of a neighborhood slowly settling into sleep. She sipped tea that had long gone cold, and flipped slowly through a printout of sealed affidavits. Faces, she remembered names. She hadn't yet said aloud, stories that would soon leave the silence behind. Her pen paused over one page. A girl, 17, stopped while walking home from work. The same words appeared again, non-compliant, erratic, subdued with minimal force. Naomi set the paper down and leaned back in her chair, her hand resting on the edge of the table like she was holding on to something she couldn't let drop. This wasn't about just one case, one cop, one courtroom. It was a ledger of neglect built over decades, and now it was finally being read aloud. But reading it was only the beginning. Holding them accountable was another storm entirely. As the clock ticked toward midnight, her phone buzzed with a message from Rosa New Movement on Drury's accounts. "We'll brief in the morning." Naomi didn't reply. Instead, she closed the folder, turned off the light, and sat in the darkness for a moment longer, breathing in the quiet, not as rest but as readiness. The unraveling had begun, and she was ready to follow it all the way to the end. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the city looked the same, but for Naomi Carter, everything had shifted beneath the surface. She walked into the federal building just after 7, the streets still damp from a quiet overnight rain, her reflection trailing beside her in the streaked glass of empty storefronts, her thoughts already 3 steps ahead. The air inside the operations room was cooler than usual, and the lights hadn't all been turned on yet, giving the space a muted tone that reminded her of old photographs, faded but still sharp where it counted. Rosa stood by the printer, arms folded, watching the machine hum slowly through the latest batch of subpoenaed documents. "We found something," she said without looking up. "And it's bigger than we thought." Naomi set her bag down, her coat still buttoned. "How far up?" she asked quietly. Rosa turned, handed her the top page, and exhaled. "Langston's name is on the authorization for the sealed transfer. He signed off on the budget line that funded the contract suppressions 5 months ago." Naomi didn't speak. She just stared at the page, her thumb pressing gently against the edge like she could hold it still long enough for her mind to catch up. She had suspected for weeks that this went beyond Drury and Kincaid, but now there it was in black and white, the state attorney general's name tangled in the same web she had spent months unraveling. The sound in the room seemed to change, like someone had turned the volume down on everything except the tension. Marcus walked in a moment later, coffee in hand, a folder tucked under his arm. "He's too careful," he said as he dropped the folder on the table. "Everything about Langston screams clean, progressive, reform-minded, press-friendly. But this is personal. He didn't just authorize those budgets, he rewrote the channels so no one would know where the money was going." Naomi opened the folder and flipped through it slowly. Campaign finance reports, emails, unsigned internal memos, all of them lining up just enough to paint the edge of a picture she hadn't wanted to believe was real. She took a deep breath, the kind that comes more from the ribs than the lungs, and sat down. Her fingers tapped once on the table before she said, "We're not dealing with a single courthouse anymore. We're dealing with a machine." one that wears a clean suit and talks about reform in the daylight while protecting its foundations in the dark. Rosa leaned forward. If we go after him, it's not just local, it becomes national. Every ally he has, every office he's connected to, it all goes under the spotlight. Naomi nodded slowly. That's exactly where it needs to be. There was a long silence, the kind that doesn't just fill a room but defines it. Naomi knew what came next. Not legally. Legally they were covered, but publicly, strategically, ethically, this was a storm that couldn't be navigated with case law alone. This was politics. And politics didn't care about truth, it cared about perception, about timing, about narrative. How much can we prove before he starts pulling strings, she asked. Marcus rubbed his jaw. We've got enough for probable cause, but it's still circumstantial. Until someone talks or we catch something recorded, he can spin it. Naomi looked at Rosa. Any movement from internal sources, Rosa hesitated. There's one. Someone on his staff reached out anonymously last week. Said they had concerns, didn't leave a name. Naomi nodded. Start there, she said. Use our secure line. No pressure, just ask what they've seen. Let them know we're listening. Then she stood, her body suddenly heavy, not with exhaustion but with clarity. Because this was what the truth looked like, at scale. It didn't come clean and wrapped in bows. It came layered in power, wrapped in nice suits and campaign slogans, waiting for someone brave enough to peel it all back. And Naomi, even with everything that weighed on her shoulders, knew she wasn't alone. Her team was ready, the evidence was growing, and now the last layer had revealed itself. That afternoon, Naomi walked the long corridor toward a closed-door meeting with the DOJ liaison, her steps quiet but firm. The walls around her felt narrower than usual, the hum of the overhead lights a little louder, the air sharp with that metallic scent of cold steel and long decisions. When she entered the room, the liaison looked up from a folder already open to a page she hadn't yet seen. You know what this means, he said, without preamble. If we move forward with Langston, you'll be the face of it. He'll come after your name, your past, your judgment. Naomi sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. He can try, she said evenly, but I'm not here to protect my name. I'm here to protect the people who never had one in rooms like these. The liaison studied her for a moment, then nodded. We'll need to prepare. Press briefings. Backup documentation. Chain of custody for every file. Naomi gave a small smile, tired but steady. We've been preparing, he just doesn't know it yet. When she left the building later that night, the streets were quieter than usual, the wind moving through the branches with a rustle that sounded like paper being turned. She walked without speaking, without music, without distraction, just her footsteps on the pavement and the echo of a truth that now had a name, a file, and a direction. She had crossed the line, not into danger, she'd been in danger before, but into the place where silence ends and consequence begins. And she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. By the end of that week, the air around Naomi Carter had changed. It didn't scream, didn't crack, didn't shatter, but it pressed in tighter, like weather shifting before a storm that hadn't yet announced itself. There were no more assumptions of anonymity, no more time to slip through hallways unnoticed or carry folders in silence. The leak hadn't come from their side, but the reaction had. Langston's office launched a public statement questioning the credibility of the investigation, suggesting politically motivated interference and demanding an external review of Naomi's conduct. The headlines didn't say her name directly at first, but she knew that would only last a day, maybe two. Inside the federal building, the tension was no longer quiet, it was concentrated. Every phone call felt heavier, every shared glance between agents carried more weight. Rosa handed her a folder marked Media Response, but didn't say a word as she set it on Naomi's desk. Naomi didn't open it immediately. She just sat back in her chair, her arms crossed, her gaze steady out the window at a sky that had gone flat and gray. It started, she said finally, and Rosa nodded. They're coming after you, she replied. Not just your work, your name, your motives, your past. Later that afternoon, the anonymous threats began to arrive first. A string of voicemails filled with static and heavy breathing, then emails marked by vague warnings about consequences and betrayal. One simply read, "You should have stayed retired." Naomi didn't flinch. She deleted them, logged them, moved on. Fear wasn't new. It was just louder now. But it wasn't the threats that pressed hardest, it was the strategy behind them. The subtle weaving of narrative meant to confuse, to cast doubt, not on the evidence but on the one holding it. A whisper campaign built on half-truths and personal shadows, designed to make the public hesitate just long enough for the old system to regroup. And Naomi, sitting at her desk long after the others had gone home, knew exactly what that pause could cost. Justice only moved when someone kept their hand on the wheel. She wasn't about to let go. That night, Rosa returned to her office eyes wide, holding a printed document with shaking fingers. "They're filing for your removal from the case," she said, citing conflict of interest, your cousin's case from Baltimore. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, then reopened them slowly, her voice calm. "They're reaching," she said, "and they're scared." Rosa sat across from her, the paper still clutched in her hands. "They know they're losing control. This is how they fight back, with paper cuts and procedural mud." Naomi leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. "Then we let them cut. But we don't bleed for show. We bleed for meaning." Her voice didn't waver, though. Her breath came just a little deeper now, her chest rising with the weight of what was coming. She had known from the first step that this wouldn't end clean, that once they threatened the foundation, the walls would try to fall back in on them. She walked home that evening under a sky that had opened just enough to let the cold in the sidewalks wet beneath streetlights that blinked in tired rhythm. Passing cars sent ripples through puddles, and her reflection followed her in broken waves. She didn't wear headphones. She didn't call anyone. She just walked steady, the wind brushing against her collar, her thoughts circling but never spiraling. It was in these moments alone outside the frame that she recalibrated. Fear would not decide her direction. It never had. Back in her apartment, she poured a glass of water, set it beside her on the table, and opened the file she hadn't dared touch since the Baltimore days. Jordan's case. 4 pages. 4 pages that cost her brother a year and a half of his youth and reshaped everything Naomi would become. She flipped to the last one, reread the language that had buried his future in bureaucratic vagueness, and set it down gently. "They think that's the end of the story," she whispered. But it was just the beginning. Just after midnight, her phone buzzed again. It was Rosa. "He wants to meet," she said. "Langston sent a request through official channels. Neutral ground. He's calling it a conversation." Naomi closed her eyes. The sound of a game being played behind mirrored glass was nothing new to her. "Where?" she asked. Rosa hesitated. "Restaurant. Private room. Downtown. Tomorrow." Naomi paused, then nodded slowly. "Tell them I'll come." When she hung up, the room was silent again. The weight of what waited in that room wasn't just political, it was personal, existential. She had climbed too many stairs built on bones to pretend this was just another step in a long career. This wasn't career, this was conscience, and she had already chosen her side. Before she went to bed, Naomi walked to the window, the city sprawling dim beneath her lights, scattered like breath held in 1,000 lungs. She placed her palm against the glass and said quietly, "You only get one chance to not flinch." Then she turned away because the fight wasn't at the window anymore, it was inside, and she was ready for it. The restaurant was tucked behind a brick facade on a quiet street downtown, the kind of place meant to feel invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Naomi arrived 5 minutes early, her coat buttoned high, her breath steady, and her eyes already scanning the sidewalk, the windows, the faces of passing strangers for anything out of place. Inside, the lights were dim, the air warm with the scent of aged leather and slow-cooked food, the kind that fills expensive rooms with an illusion of comfort. A hostess greeted her by name without asking, then led her to a private dining room in the back where the curtains were already drawn, and the sound of the city felt like something muffled behind glass. Victor Langston was seated at the far end of the table, framed by shadows, his tailored suit a shade darker than his smile. He stood as she entered, extended his hand with the ease of a man who had offered peace in dozens of rooms just like this one. Naomi took her seat without touching his hand, resting her folder on the edge of the table, her fingers still, her eyes calm but unflinching. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," he said, his voice smooth, measured with that same polished cadence that had made him a favorite on podiums and press junkets. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "You didn't give me much choice." Langston chuckled softly, the kind of laugh designed to disarm, to charm, to erase the edge from a blade already drawn. "I think we both know you're not a woman easily pushed," he replied, "which is why I'm hoping we can find a path forward, one that doesn't end in destruction." Naomi said nothing at first. She studied him, the small twitch in his jaw, the subtle way his eyes kept drifting toward her folder as if it held a fire he hadn't yet figured out how to contain. "You mean a path where I step back quietly," she said, "so you can preserve the structure, repaint the walls, and tell the public the leak's been sealed." Langston's smile faded just a fraction, enough for the real man to begin showing beneath the performance. "I'm offering you a way to keep your legacy intact," he said. "You walk away, no scandal, no trials. We'll even credit your investigation publicly, call it the catalyst for a new statewide integrity initiative. You'd lead it, full control. Your name on the masthead." Naomi leaned forward, her hands still folded, her voice low. "You think I did all this for a title?" The air between them thickened the silence, now carrying something heavier, disrespect cloaked as strategy. Langston shifted in his seat. "I'm saying you've made your point. You shook the system. But if you keep going, this turns into a collapse. You take me down, you take others with me. Some good people, some innocent." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in precision. "You're not afraid of collapse," she said. "You're afraid people will finally see what was built on the other side of your podium." Langston exhaled slowly. "You're walking into fire, Naomi. The kind that doesn't stop at politics. You think the people cheering you now will still be there when the smoke settles?" She didn't answer right away. She looked past him for a moment at the darkened window, where her own reflection hovered like a ghost just beyond the glass. Then she looked back. "I'm not doing this for cheers, and I'm not afraid of fire. I've lived in it too long to believe the burn is worse than the silence." The conversation shifted then, not in volume, but in gravity. Langston leaned back in his chair, the weight of the offer no longer sitting between them but dissolving in the air, irrelevant now. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "You could have had everything." Naomi stood slowly, her movements deliberate, controlled. "I don't want everything," she said. "I want the truth to mean something again." She turned to leave her coat, brushing the back of the chair, her folder still under her arm, unopened but unforgotten. Behind her, Langston's voice followed, not loud, not desperate, but edged with disbelief. "You really think you can tear this down and still survive it?" Naomi paused at the door, looked over her shoulder with a gaze so level it seemed to stop time for half a breath. "I don't intend to survive it," she said. "I intend to rebuild it." Outside, the wind had picked up sharp against her face as she stepped into the night, the sound of distant sirens weaving through the silence like a warning or a promise. She didn't hurry. She walked with the same rhythm she had always known, deliberate, even steady. This wasn't about headlines anymore. It wasn't about courtrooms or cameras. It was about who held the pen when the story ended and who had the courage to rewrite the final page. Back in her apartment, the night hung quiet around her like a waiting breath. She poured herself a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched the city move beneath her, still unaware, yet poised on the edge of something that could not be undone. She could feel it now, not fear, but certainty. A threshold crossed, a line drawn not in sand but in stone, and once crossed there was no turning back. She sipped the water slowly, the taste of resolve sharp on her tongue, and said to the empty room, "They think this is the end, but it's just the hinge." Then she set the glass down, turned off the light, and let the dark settle around her, not as a threat, but as a space where new truths were about to begin. 3 days after Naomi walked out of that restaurant, the city no longer hummed with its usual rhythm. It buzzed with something sharper, tighter, like a wire pulled too far, ready to snap. News anchors spoke her name. With hesitant authority, legal analysts debated her strategy in tense, clipped segments, and across courthouse steps, protesters raised signs with words that echoed her own testimony. But for Naomi, none of it felt triumphant. The recognition didn't land as praise. It landed like a responsibility being handed back to her over and over, every time someone said, "We're counting on you." Inside the federal building, the atmosphere had shifted again, not panicked, not chaotic, but purposeful, like a body adjusting to a wound it now had to protect. Rosa met Naomi in the elevator early that morning, her shoulders stiff, a file clutched to her chest with both hands. "They're reopening 5 of Drury's past cases," she said, voice low, eyes scanning the corner of the ceiling out of habit. "And Kincaid's trying to negotiate a deal. He's asking for immunity in exchange for everything he knows about Langston's back channels." Naomi said nothing at first. The elevator doors slid open, and she walked forward, the sound of her heels tapping out a rhythm that felt older than the building itself. When they reached the operations room, she finally spoke. "He doesn't get immunity for being afraid now. He gets a chance to tell the truth for once, and that's it." Rosa nodded, a trace of relief in her eyes, like she needed to hear Naomi say it out loud to believe they weren't bending. "We've come too far," Naomi added, her voice calm but final. "This isn't about survival. It's about resolution." Later that afternoon, Naomi sat in a small conference room, one wall lined with black and white photographs of the city's earliest courtrooms. Men in robes, gavel in hand, all of them white, all of them unsmiling. She stared at one of the frames while the DOJ liaison briefed her on the upcoming grand jury procedures. His voice was clear but distant, like background music, in a scene where something more important was happening inside the silence. "Once you testify," he said, "you lose the shield we've given you. You'll be public exposed, every word will be scrutinized." Naomi nodded once slowly. "Let them scrutinize," she replied. "I didn't come here to whisper." That evening, the streets outside her apartment pulsed with tension, not violent, not angry, but alert, as if the city itself was waiting for something to be set in motion. Naomi stood by the window, her reflection faint against the darkness, her phone in her hand, unread messages lining the screen. Some were threats veiled and clumsy. Others were offers, book deals, interviews, appearances. She ignored them all. She hadn't come this far to become a headline. She came to become the end of one. She thought about her cousin Jordan, about his eyes, the day he was released, how they didn't light up like they used to, how something behind them stayed dim even years later. She thought about how he never asked her to do any of this, how he stayed quiet, moved on, learned to live around the crack that had been carved into his life. And she thought about how justice, even when delivered, could never quite fill that space. It could only keep it from spreading further. The next morning, Naomi arrived early at the federal courthouse, the sun still low, the light gold and quiet across the marble steps. Inside, security moved faster, now everyone alert, everyone aware of who she was. She walked through without looking back, without flinching at the extra guards or the whisper of her name that followed her down the corridor. When she entered the grand jury room, it was cool, and still the kind of stillness that demanded truth and left no room for performance. The prosecutors looked up as she entered, one of them rising to hand her a folder. "Do you wish to submit your documents first?" he asked. Naomi glanced at the folder, then shook her head. "No," she said gently. "Let me speak first." She sat down, adjusted her jacket, and looked at the 12 jurors in front of her, each of them waiting, each of them holding space for what she was about to give. She didn't read from notes. She didn't rehearse her lines. She spoke the way people do when something has lived inside them too long and finally finds the shape it's been waiting for. She spoke about silence, about the spaces between laws where injustice learns to live, about the choices that weren't accidents, the cover-ups that weren't coincidences, the weight of stories never believed. She told them about Kincaid, about Drury, about Langston. But more than that, she told them about what it meant to live in a system that only heard you when you screamed, and what it cost to stay quiet just to survive. When she finished, the room didn't applaud. No one stood. There was only stillness, the kind that says something sacred has just been witnessed. The lead prosecutor closed the file, nodded once, and said, "We'll contact you with the panel's decision." Naomi nodded, stood, and walked out without another word. Outside, the light had shifted. The wind had picked up, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel tired. But it wasn't defeat. It was the weight of having finally said everything she'd come to say, and knowing the echo would outlive her voice. Weeks passed not like a storm crashing through, but like a slow tide rising, changing the shape of everything before anyone realized how far it had come. Inside the courthouse, the walls hadn't moved, but the silence that once protected power now held something different: accountability. Naomi Carter walked those same hallways again, not with the anonymity of before, but with the quiet gravity of someone who had seen the machine from the inside and lived to name every one of its gears. The staff nodded now, not just out of courtesy, but from recognition, a deeper kind of respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with truth. Marcus Dale pled guilty in federal court to multiple counts of obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, and civil rights violations. His sentencing hearing was short, efficient, brutal in its finality. He didn't look at Naomi as he was escorted out, but she watched him until the courtroom doors closed behind his shackled frame. Drury, facing professional disgrace, accepted permanent disbarment in exchange for his full cooperation with the Department of Justice Review Board. Every ruling he'd authored in the last decade was flagged for audit. His name was removed from plaques, his portrait taken down, and when he left the city, it was quiet, unsentimental, like a man exiting a building he no longer had the keys to. Langston held on longer, but not by much. The audio recording sealed his fate more effectively than any formal charge. His resignation arrived on a Friday afternoon, tucked behind a carefully worded press release. By Monday, federal charges followed. Naomi didn't attend the press conference. She didn't watch the cameras or take interviews. She stayed where the work was, on the ground in motion, helping build something to fill the hollow left behind. A new office was opened not in the marble towers downtown, but in a modest building on the city's south side. Naomi helped design it herself: soft blue walls, wide windows, and a front desk that greeted people with a sign that read, "We hear you." It wasn't just symbolic, it was a promise. Her title was small, intentionally understated, but her presence loomed large in the rooms where change finally felt like something you could hold in your hands. Her days were long, but full. Mothers who'd lost sons came to tell their stories. Young attorneys seeking guidance asked to sit with her. Old officers, who'd once been afraid to speak, now brought forward documents they had kept buried in desk drawers for years. She listened more than she spoke. She shook every hand, remembered every name, and wrote every single file by hand before passing it along to her team. One afternoon, as she prepared to leave, the receptionist handed her a plain white envelope, no return address, just her name written neatly in blue ink. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. On it were 7 words: "You gave me my voice back. Thank you." She didn't recognize the handwriting, and that didn't matter. She held the note in her hand for a long time, standing in the doorway of her office as the sun poured in behind her. It wasn't closure, but it was peace. The kind that isn't gifted but earned. In the evenings, she still walked the city alone, sometimes coat buttoned-up, shoes clicking against the sidewalk, the sounds of buses and distant traffic settling into the rhythm of her thoughts. She'd look at the courthouse steps from across the street now, mostly empty, and think about how many years those stairs had meant silence. Now they meant something else. They meant possibility. People sometimes asked her if it had all been worth it. If the threats, the isolation, the sacrifices had really made a difference. Naomi never gave them easy answers. She just said, "Ask me again in 10 years. Ask me when no one else is afraid to speak first." Back in her apartment, the folders were finally gone from the dining table. The walls were bare again, save for one framed photo of her and her cousin Jordan taken before everything cracked open. He still called sometimes. Not often. But when he did, his voice sounded steadier than before, like he no longer carried the weight of being unseen. The story wasn't over, but it had turned. The arc had bent slowly, forcefully, permanently. Naomi didn't think of herself as a hero. She didn't need to. What she needed was exactly what had been built, a place where truth didn't have to shout to be heard, where silence no longer protected the wrong people, and where justice wasn't a performance but a process. And if you stood beside her now, if you listened carefully to the way she speaks, the way she walks, the way she holds the world in her hands with both steadiness and fire, you'd understand something that can't be written into law. When people can stop being afraid of men like Marcus, like Drury, like Langston, that's when the real change begins. And that's what Naomi Carter had given them. Not revenge, not spectacle, but permission to speak, to rise, to remember. And in doing so, she didn't just change the system, she rewrote where it begins. What Naomi Carter's story reminds us is that justice doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins in the quiet decisions we make when no one's watching. It begins when someone refuses to look away, when someone chooses truth over comfort, and when silence is no longer an option. This story isn't just about exposing corruption, it's about the courage it takes to confront power with patience, with evidence, and with dignity. And more importantly, it's a reminder that no one is ever truly invisible, that even those overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated can change the entire course of a system that believed itself untouchable. For those of you watching, especially our elders, our wisdom keepers, let this story be a spark. Let it remind you that it's never too late to ask questions, to speak up, to guide the next generation towards something better. Because the world still needs steady hands and brave voices to hold the line between what is and what should be. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've seen or someone you've known, please like this video. Share it with others who believe in truth and justice and the quiet strength of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel. We're here to tell the stories that matter, stories that echo, stories that last. Let's keep the conversation going. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is listen and then speak.